Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our plenary panel for this morning. But before I do that, let me just take a moment to acknowledge the leadership of this university, the inspiring work of so many faculty, staff, colleagues across the university over the last 7 months in allowing us to transition to a moment which really is representing a fundamental change in the educational enterprise. And I just want to acknowledge also the efforts of the entire Hilton VPAL team, with whom it's been my absolute privilege to work with over the last 7 months in particular, for all the efforts in creating and organizing this HILT conference. The topic for this morning is, for the plenary panel, is inclusive excellence. And I just want to say I didn't come up with the title, but I find it to be an inspired choice because it's in particular hints at two sets of issues. One, that we're not just aspiring for excellence around issues of inclusivity, but also thinking deep and hard about how inclusivity can reinforce broader educational excellence. The questions that we're going to examine this morning are questions like, how do inequities show up in the classroom in small and large ways, in ways that we see and also ways that are less observable, in ways that are unintended, frankly. And on this, I even think about really mundane issues like the grading system during the COVID spring, when to preserve the educational model, obviously, we want students to work hard. For that, you might think we need a grading rubric, but how do you come up with a grading system without also creating inequities when certain students just lack basic access? These are the kinds of tensions that are so real and palpable, and all of us are struggling to deal with. How do we think about student success in these environments? Or how do we think about rethinking student success metrics from an equity perspective? These are the kinds of questions that Sherry Ann Charleston is going to moderate this morning. Sherry is Harvard's first Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, who comes to us from Madison, Wisconsin, and has been with us at Harvard for just under 3 months. I've already had the privilege of working with Sherry on multiple occasions, and we're really fortunate to have her at Harvard at this moment in time. Sherry is an accomplished academic, administrator, and attorney. Our other panelists are Anthony Abraham Jack, assistant professor in the Graduate School of Education and author of The Privileged Poor: How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students. Maria Luisa Parra, preceptor in Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard, and a real innovator around bilingual and multilingual development. And finally, Clint Smith, who received his PhD from the Graduate School of Education, is now a staff writer at The Atlantic, author of Counting Dissent in 2017, and of the soon-to-be-released book On How the Word is Passed, which explores how different historical sites reckon or don't reckon with their relationship to the history of slavery. The panel will last 35 minutes of conversation between Sherry and the panelists, followed by Q&A. It's my pleasure to turn it over to Sherry.
Thank you, Parath. And thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to be with you all today. It really is a pleasure. To my esteemed panelists, I am so excited to be on this panel with you all this morning. I think this is going to be a wonderful and deep conversation. As all of you all know, our task today is really to unearth some potential approaches to how we're going to bolster equitable and inclusive classroom instruction. As Larry mentioned in his comments, and thank you to both Larry and Parath and Alan for their warm welcome and comments. One of my interests is really in thinking about how we translate theory into practice. And I know from talking to my colleagues on this panel that they all share that passion. For those of you all who know me, intellectually, you'll hear me say multiple times that all roads for me, and at least most roads of academic inquiry, lead back to one of Harvard's most famous alumni, W.E.B. Du Bois. In his essay, Strivings of the Negro People, Du Bois posed a problem, a question that I use to foreground important conversations in my classroom with my students all the time. I'll bring his words into the space to give us a sort of foregrounding as we start our discussion. He wrote, "Between me and the other world, there's ever an unasked question, unasked by some through feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it, all nevertheless flutter around it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then instead of saying directly, 'How does it feel to be a problem?' they say, 'I know an excellent colored man in my town,' or 'I fought in Mechanicville,' or 'Do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil?' At these I smile or am interested or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I seldom answer a word." To my mind, Souls of Black Folk is one of the most important collection of essays ever written. I'm sure many of my panelists would probably agree. And I continue to find these brilliant probing essays as prescient today as they were when they were initially crafted, and a useful launching pad from which to foster what I would say is a productive conversation that eschews the sort of common trap of treating students as problems to be solved, rather than engaging the problem of inequality. And as Alan and Parath spoke to, our job today is really to think about these broader structures of inequality that shape the experience of our students, and hopefully to provide some solutions for the audience that will help us start to think about this. Now, I start this to underscore the central tenet that we'll be focusing on asset-based approaches today. As committed as we are to this, we know that we won't solve all the problems today. We're just starting the discussion, but I'm thankful to HILT and to the VPAL team for creating this space so that we can start having these probing conversations as we begin our journey together. So, without further ado, I want to bring my fellow panelists into this discussion as we start to think about how we're going to define this problem. So I want to start, Anthony, Maria, maybe give you all an opportunity to kick us off and weigh in on this question. If you could, tell us a little bit about how you in your teaching and research see inequality showing up in the context of the classroom. And if you could, give us a sense of what the main pain points are that you think really need to be addressed. Anthony, we'll start with you and then Maria.
Again, thank you all for inviting me and for also to Sherry for bringing Du Bois into this conversation. Period. That's all I have to, I really do appreciate that. For me, this is both, my research informs my teaching and vice versa. I study students who are first in their families to go to college and lower income college students. And as many universities have reached out to recruit more and more lower income and first generation college students, they diversify at a rate that sadly outpaces their preparation for when students arrive on campus. And when students arrive, both in the classrooms and in the houses, they encounter that hidden curriculum, right? That system of unwritten rules and unset expectations. They don't know that, if you did not either, if you didn't have parents who went to school, who went to college, especially like a college that resembles the one that they're at, or if you didn't go to a school like Andover or Exeter or Deerfield, words like office hours may seem totally foreign to you. And so you don't know how to navigate them, or that you know that you should, right? So in my research, and for all those, I'm sorry you have to hear me say this again, we always say when office hours are, but we almost never say what they are. We expect students to know the lingo, the shorthand, the nomenclature of our campus before they arrive, or at least we operate as if we do. And so the question for me is, a lot of students get tripped up on the social side of academic life, because it's not that they struggle with the material and that's their biggest problem. Their biggest problem oftentimes, they don't know how to get the help to master the material. They understand it well enough, but they haven't had that meeting in office hours to help them understand how the professor thinks about a problem or a homework assignment, which gives you insight into how that person thinks about writing a test prep question, right? And so understanding how you get to know different things and how this bleeds outside the classroom, and how it factors how students think about the Office of Career Services or different support services, the fellowship office, study abroad. Like this understanding about how to navigate this particular place and know what these offices are are oftentimes the biggest hurdles, that if we actually met students where they are and not where we expect them to be, not academically, but socially, about navigating this very, very wealthy, elite, predominantly white space, we can do a better service to all our students and create more of a floor for them to stand on rather than a ceiling for them to bump into.
No, I think well said, well said. Maria, I want to give you a chance to jump into this conversation too.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm going to echo my thanks, like Tony did, to the HILT team and for this space to talk about these so important issues. Well, I approach inequality in the classroom from a position and a perspective of a Mexican linguist that have worked for many years with Latinx children and families and young Latinx. That I have become aware in these interactions with them that they have, by the time they arrive to an institution like Harvard, they have made really significant efforts, them and their families, to navigate and to succeed within a system that through different mechanisms push them out systematically. But they managed to succeed, and it's a system that does not support their linguistic and cultural heritage and their assets. I know that this panel and the conference is about assets. So these students, Latinx students, have tremendous linguistic and cultural assets that they work with them every day, but they are not recognized or valued. On the contrary, they are oftentimes stigmatized. And by the time they come to Harvard and the Spanish language classroom, they arrive with histories of discrimination, stigmatization that have undermined their own sense of identity. And also with the awareness that linguistic resources in Spanish, even when the language has been spoken in these countries since the 16th century as a colonial language first, but now as a minority language, those resources are geared towards a specific group of students that they want to learn the language as a foreign language or as a second language, but there are no resources or classes, spaces for Latinx heritage, young people that want to engage with this knowledge that they have. So in my classroom, that's the first question I have to ask myself. The histories, their lived experiences that they bring as Spanish speakers and as a community, powerful community that has contributed to this country in very significant ways. Nonetheless, they have been marginalized and stigmatized, not represented in the curriculum throughout the system of education.
I love that. As you were talking, I was thinking about Tara Yoso's work. How we think about the various strengths that students bring with them into the space, and the ways in which classrooms, particularly classrooms and higher education spaces, don't often speak to the strengths that many of our students bring. I'm a native Detroiter, and my mother told me when I was growing up that if I could live in Detroit, I could live anywhere. And there's something about, I think, the ethic that I bring to, my work that is very similar to, I think, strengths that my family members probably also possessed without the ability to go to college, right? And so I think that there's a way that we often don't think about the ways in which our students are coming with these rich resources. So I really do love that. So between your two comments, I think we got a sense for what some of the barriers are. What are some of the things that students are both bringing in terms of assets and resources, and how can those assets, resources, and strengths perhaps be used to help them think about how they might be best positioned to be able to navigate some of the barriers that I think are endemic to higher education. Clint, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in here and give us any perspectives that you might have that might speak to that, or to help us start to think about how we start to approach these challenges as they show up in our classrooms.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all again for having me. I think the first thing you all should do is buy Dr. Jack's book, which is basically the Bible of this entire discussion. I'm not his official publicist, but I am this book's hype man, because I think it is incredibly essential for us understanding. It's an incredibly illuminating and essential text for understanding the way that first generation students, and often students of color, as those things are correlated, navigate this experience. And so on a classroom level, I think that it's important for faculty to understand that many of the young people coming in, I think we can take for granted, especially at institutions like Harvard, take for granted that many of our students, as intelligent as they are, as well equipped as they are intellectually, are still coming into college in the context of a world that has told them over and over and over again that they are the exception to the rule, right? That these students are exceptional, that like you have somehow escaped an otherwise a culture or a community that is otherwise laden with laziness or saturated with violence or embedded with sort of all of these deficit oriented conceptions of who they are. And I think that, so what happens is that our students are told that they are exceptional in ways that are meant as a compliment, but ultimately are legitimizing a sort of larger sort of set of oppressive conditions and social forces that have made it so that, there's always going to be a handful of people who escape systems of oppression to legitimate that oppression. And so I think we need to be careful in the language that we use with our students, even if we are attempting to say, like, look how remarkable you are, look how intelligent you are, to not suggest that they are an exception to a culture, that they are an exception to a community. And to recognize, I think all the time about James Baldwin's 1963 essay, A Talk to Teachers, in which he talks about how one of the most important things for a teacher to do is to, understand that so many of, in the audience of the educators he was speaking to, that those students are told over and over again that they are criminal, right? That they are, and that they are the reason that certain communities look the way that they do is their fault, rather than the fault of the larger systems and structures that have shaped those communities. But Baldwin is asking us to flip that and to say it's not the students who are criminals, not their families who are criminal, it's the society that has created the conditions that have made it so that so few students can sort of escape a set of difficult social conditions that, again, are created not by the people in those communities, but by things that have been done to those communities over and over again. In my own experience in college, it was my ethnic studies class that gave me the language to understand that so much of what I had heard from the world about me, about my community, about New Orleans, where I grew up, about this country, was a lie, right? And I think there's something deeply liberating and something deeply emancipatory for young people to be given the tools and the history and the sociology and the literature to be able to better name, identify, and make sense of who they are in relationship to the world that oftentimes run counter to the narratives that they've been inundated with. And so I think it's really important for faculty, in the social sciences, but not just in the social sciences, and in all sorts of contexts, to make sure that we are bringing those conversations directly into our classroom. And beyond that, I think it's really important for young people to have community, right? Like to have community in which, and Tony writes about this in his book, how important it is for folks to know that they are not alone in experiencing these things, because it can be a deeply isolating feeling. And if you don't have a community, formal or informal, that you can lean on in those moments, then I think that one begins to feel that the difficulties they are experiencing are somehow unique to them, rather than reflective of sort of structural failure of the institution to provide them with the things that they need.
If I can add to that, I really appreciate you bringing in that Baldwin, because the entire institution has to change how they view community, especially as it pertains to our students. Community is not the adversary, but the ally. When I think about bringing students in, especially those from, though we need to probably change the language, non-traditional families, or rather those who have not been at Harvard for generations, we think about, the only time we talk to families or from students' community is either family weekend, homecoming, or when we're asking them to send care packages. We don't do enough outreach. We don't do enough conversation, community, of building of ties with family, so that students are not caught between, especially lower income and first generation college students, but also students who are like women in the sciences, right? And having them to choose between people who work their butt off for 18 years to get them to the place that they're at now, who's giving them one piece of advice because they only know how to navigate certain institutions like a job, where showing up for work and not making a fuss and people not knowing your name, but just knowing that you're going to come in is how you keep your job, versus people who they just met, who have the positions or the titles or the degrees they want, but you don't know from Adam. So who do you trust in this situation? But the thing is, the university only responds to those who have been here before, alumni, or those who can donate in certain ways, or those who they can reach out to because they know the lingo, they know they know how to navigate this space. And all of a sudden, the students who are left to make a choice, do you turn your back on, when to use their language, the people who got you here, or the community who helped you get here, who pooled resources to buy you the first laptop that you ever had, who bought you your first winter jacket knowing that you're coming from Arizona or Miami or other places that, don't have snow, or those people who you just met who have the fancy robes and the poofy hats. And who do you choose? And so a lot of students feel this tension, and that tension happens in the classroom, in the dorms, in the support services. And many of our students feel lost because there hasn't been a communication. There hasn't been any attempt to broker these two communities, with the exception of financial aid or an admission letter. And that is problematic.
Yeah, so it's interesting. If I could, the organizers will not let me move off of screen, but if I could, I would go and reach and get my copy of The Privileged Poor, which is sitting right next to me. So just imagine me grabbing it myself and putting it here, right, and waving it.
Change the title of the panel to be The Privileged Poor.
The Privileged Poor. And for those of you all who know me, I spent many years working in pre-college programs, working with programs like Posse, thinking about how we use these sort of pipeline programs to create spaces and communities for students. And as we were sort of thinking about our approach to the work, we grabbed The Privileged Poor, right, to help us think about how we create space for students once they get to college. So I just want to echo that and underscore that as well. All three of you really hit on a few things that I want to pull out for the audience so that we can dig a little deeper into it. I love this idea that sort of thinking about how we inadvertently encourage deficit thinking in our students by talking to them about their exceptionality, right? As opposed to talking about them as, sort of in many ways, not exceptional. And that's an interesting rub, especially at a place like Harvard, where all of our students think that they're exceptional, right? And they are exceptional. They absolutely are. But when we think about that in the context of the communities that many students of color, first generation students, low income students are coming from, something I say all the time, I am not exceptional. Right? I am an example of someone who had access to resources, and how is it that those resources have created the space for me to be successful? So I want to think a little bit about what that looks like in the practical sense in the context of how we engage with our students. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to sort of pick up that you all talked about is a sort of idea around familial capital. So many of us come to institutions of higher education, first generation students, first generation Americans are coming into this space and are experiencing that tension, feeling as if we have to divorce ourselves from the context in which we emerge, because we don't think that it'll give us the sort of navigational cultural capital that we need to be able to move inside this environment of higher education. But in reality, you know, Tony, I think what you're sort of pushing us to think about is how we might want to encourage students to actually draw on that, to think about sort of what success looks like, and define it for themselves in ways that might help them navigate the space. The third thing that I heard is thinking about how we place students in the context of community, and making sure that they don't feel isolated. So as they're experiencing sometimes microaggressions or imposter syndrome, they're thinking about, you know, them not being alone. So those are sort of three concrete things that I heard from the points that you all made, right? Things that we can be doing as interventions in the work, as we sort of think about how we translate what we know to what we want students to think about. So I throw that out there because I also want to give Maria a chance to get in here. Is there anything else that we're missing as we, you know, from that list, as we think about how we then move from this discussion of what the challenges and problems are to how we actually create equitable learning environments based on these principles?
Right, thank you, Sherry. So I think that, you know, Clint touched on something very important, in that I try to open up that space in my class as well, that it's critical thinking. And because I base my teaching and research on Paulo Freire's pedagogical principles, these to provide students with opportunities for them to engage in critical thinking through dialogue, productive dialogue around these important issues. In my case, for example, the access to Spanish resources. But also I want to bring into the discussion the topic of culture. And I know, Sherry, that you have worked also on the importance of having a cultural relevant content and curriculum. So it's give students access, but also that content that they're going to access speaks meaningful to their stories, lived experiences, and overall contributions to this society and history of the country. So I don't think it's just the access to the resources, is the quality, the content of these resources that has to be also be part of the discussion. And having said that, I have once a student that in his final paper, that it was a reflection paper on what they have learned about themselves throughout the class, he wrote about his new awareness about the value of his family and all of what he has learned and inherited from his family. So I think that this point, it's key to provide students with that support, as Tony points out in his book. It's not just admitting the student, it's how are we going to pave the way through 4 years to ensure that they have the resources that are culturally sensitive for them to succeed and value what they have learned to undermine because all the messages that they have received otherwise. So I would just add that point on cultural sensitivity, that it's so important in what President Bacow pointed out at the beginning of his speech, connections and interactions.
And just briefly, just to build on what Maria said, I think it's really, really important to hone down on that because, again, this idea of exceptionalism, so many of these young people, especially at institutions like Harvard, are consumed with this idea that they've often internalized, that they've been inundated with, of escape, right? Like they have to escape their communities or they have to escape the place that they're coming from. And this is because that place, implicit within that is that place is bad and holding them back. And this other place is good and where they can achieve mobility. And I think we have to problematize and complicate even that idea, right? Like the notion of escape also suggests that like areas and communities and spaces are static, or that the reason that they look the way that they do was a sort of inevitability of the cultures that and demographics that live within them, rather than helping students to understand that they don't need to escape a place in order to create a meaningful or valuable life, but instead to understand, to come to a place like this to better understand why this place, why a place like Harvard looks the way that it does, a place like Cambridge looks the way that it does, and why a place like, as Tony writes in his book, certain parts of Miami look the way that they do, and to understand that that is not reflective of the people in those communities or what they're capable of or not capable of, but instead is a result of decades of economic disinvestment, decades of economic plunder, decades of public policy decisions that have invested social, cultural, economic infrastructure into certain places and not to others. And to really, to make sure our students don't feel like they have to leave people or places behind in order to be successful moving forward.
No, absolutely. I love that. And Maria, I appreciate you bringing in the culturally relevant piece. Some colleagues and I were thinking about the sort of the forgotten legacy or the unfinished business of Brown v. Board. And this idea that part of what we lost in the sort of post-Brown moment is many of the skills that teachers, particularly African-American teachers in Black communities were using to basically to do the work that we're talking about now, give students this sense of self, pride in their communities and sort of where they come from, and understand how they can then use that in navigational contexts. And then Clint, as you were talking, it actually reminded me of this experience that I had with a former student, now colleague of mine, Danez Smith, who's a National Book Award winning poet. And for those who know Danez's work, he is unapologetically Black, unapologetically queer, just a lovely human being and a powerful person. And someone asked him a question: how did you get to be unapologetically Black in your work? And he said, I had no idea that I should be any other way. And part of that was because, as he said, he encountered a faculty member, Ahmad Johnson, who's also an award-winning poet, who actually just came out with a new book that I would encourage people to also take a look at. And he said, when I wrote my first poem in Ahmad's lecture, I talked about Al Green and hot grits. Now, if Ahmad had discouraged me from bringing in that metaphor into my work, I would have probably gone down another path, and perhaps I could be sitting here talking about, Renaissance literature today. But because he encouraged me and said, well, let's explore that. I like that, right? It helped him to think about how he could further those ideas. And we see the outgrowth of that, right? Again, National Book Award winning poet. So the question that I'm sort of posing to you all then, as we think about how we create these sort of inclusive spaces and opportunities for our students to thrive, right? Again, thinking about, how we help them to also value where they come from and their language. And we see this CRT work, sort of traditionally thinks about how we're bringing in our own stories. How do you all think we should be defining student success from an equity-minded perspective? How should we in our classrooms be thinking about cultivating spaces like that, right, for students to bring their whole selves into it in a way that allows them to achieve their definition of success or a fuller definition of success, even when it perhaps abuts against our own ideas of what students need to be learning or how they need to be approaching the curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to build off of your point, I think, I know Danez's work, and it's incredible. And I think Danez would also say that part of what's important is to recognize that those things aren't mutually exclusive, right? That one does not have to, that there are different types of social and cultural capital that have, and this is work that sociologists have been thinking about for a long time, but there are different types of social and cultural capital that are, and we have told ourselves because of history of white supremacy that one is more valuable than the other. But instead, we should reject the false choice between spending time with Renaissance literature and, or poetry from the Renaissance, in the context of Renaissance literature, and poetry that writes about Al Green and collard greens and the lilt in our grandmother's voice, right? Like those that those things carry equally valuable those are equally valuable things to be writing about. That one does not mean that you have or lack more intellectual or social or cultural capital than another. And I think just really part of the biases of educators and faculty members can be to legitimate and to espouse the most value onto that which we have been trained to think should carry the most value. But I think part of the work of faculty is to sort of push ourselves to unlearn some of the things that we might have learned in our own education about like what sort of, in the context of a writing assignment, if somebody is citing, a Greek poet or a Roman poet, and if somebody is citing their great aunt, or the person at the barbecue joint or whatever, whatever the case may be, that we don't have to suggest that those ideas and those voices have no place here, because all we're doing then is reifying a very sort of myopic conception of who gets to create ideas and who gets to participate in intellectual discourse, that I think is harmful not only to the student, but it's harmful to us as a society, because then we continue to have ideas and opinions and narratives that are only shaped and valued in the context of a very limited amount of people.
Absolutely. Tony, I want to give you a chance to jump in here. I'm sure you have some insights on this, and then Maria too.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that we, in how we construct our syllabi, right, is incredibly important. Because I don't want anyone to come away from this conversation thinking that this is something that's only rooted in, the humanities or the social sciences, where it's more about people interactions. I mean, even in the science courses, right? The way in which we can actually bring in history to talk about some of these, some of the changes, like, do we really have to have a book, or, do we have to wait for, Hidden Figures to come out for us to understand the contribution of the human computers, right? And the Black women who literally helped us get to the, get into space and different things like that. Do we lose on the history or the significance of Henrietta Lacks and understanding how a lot of what we've learned in the science, there's a way in which I think that when we try to keep things that are not, when we try to teach things in a neutral way that are not neutral, I think we do a damage on the significance that so many different groups have contributed to the academic enterprise and how we can bring in different things like this. I mean, think about half the faculty that we have in in history of science, right? A lot of people who wrote about, I think about Dean Hammonds and Dean Brandt and some of their research on uncovering a lot of the hidden stories, or the stories that no one wants told about the racism and the sexism in the scientific enterprise. We think about, I want us to center those stories, right? Because they're not just individual moments, that one-off things. That's part of the enterprise of that we need to acknowledge and we need to deal with. And so when I think about creating this inclusive community, right, part of it is not just saying, oh, I'm going to put this Black person on the syllabus, I'm going to put this woman on the syllabus. It's actually making known that there's a reason why why certain things are so uneven. And actually putting voice to some of that can actually not necessarily, you're not discouraging people, you're actually telling, this is what it was and this is how we can move forward. Right. And so there are different ways in which we can do it. But I hope that as we approach these issues in the classroom, we don't just keep them in the classroom. Because, I remember a lot of people said, like, when I was reading the book, and I appreciate the very kind things you all have said, it's very interesting. I never enter the actual classroom in the book, and that's purposeful. Right. There's so much that goes on that it has implications for what goes on inside the classroom, but how so much of undergraduate and I want to say graduate school too, so much of these inequalities permeate every facet of academic life, that it can't just be, it has to be a shift in framework about how we approach teaching, how we approach communicating our material to people, and also deciding what material we're communicating, because it's more, it definitely is more of that marathon, but it's like the way in which we need to make sure that it's not, okay, we're going to focus on this one thing and kind of like put it in a bubble and then not worry about it other places. That's not actually going to root out these more systemic issues that students are facing in progression. And actually, we need to actually like think about expanding it well beyond that.
Yes, Maria, I'm going to give you the last word on this, and then we're going to shift to Q&A and take some questions from the audience so that they can get on this discussion as well. So Maria, go ahead.
Of course, thank you. So two things. First of all, I think that we need to keep thinking about the students, but also we need to start thinking about ourselves in terms of what we bring into the classroom in terms of our notions and preconceptions, assumptions about who our students are, who the students are there in the classroom ready to engage with new knowledge. We as teachers bring assumptions. We take things for granted, as you have already said, that we need to think about and problematize. For me, that has been a very important first step in my work with my students. So I can engage, I can listen to them, I can step back and take more a role of facilitator. So they bring their own experiences, and we become a community of inquiry that co-construct knowledge. And in that setting, for me, the definition of success, and I'm going to take here the first question that with which you opened the panel, Sherry. How do you feel, how does it feel to be a problem? For me, success is when the student realizes that he is not a problem or she is not a problem. They are not a problem, they're a problem. The problem is situated in the system, in the history, in the structures. So for me, success is when students realize that she's not a problem and she wants to keep engaging in the learning of her language and culture as a journey in her personal and professional academic life.
No, great. We have a couple of questions that were already put in the chat. One, I think we already sort of spoke to, which is thinking about underrepresented first-gen students as they're sort of torn between the sort of dominant and assimilation question, and thinking about how they have to succeed, right? And helping students to navigate this. I think we answered that. But there was a particular request that we talk about graduate and professional students, and that'll be the last thing that we'll have an opportunity to talk about, and we'll have about 4 minutes. So I want you all to sort of speak to this question around, in particular, how do these things apply to graduate and professional students, right? And how should we be thinking about this?
I was glad I saw that question, I think by Judy. Every semester that I've been at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I've had a student come to me and say that my office hours was the first time they had ever met one-on-one with a professor. Mm-hmm. And the only reason why they felt comfortable coming to me is because of how out I am about being a low-income first-generation college student. And we talked about it in the class and things like that. This process of supporting or the diversifying of college campuses is not limited to just the undergraduate college, the university itself, right? We are trying to still recruit more students in the sciences, more students in professional schools. And a lot of the hidden curriculum still persists, right? It changes a little bit, but it's still there. When this past year, I got a chance to speak at the American Association of Medical Colleges. Medicine and law are two of the most hereditary professions, right? Think about if you are a doctor or a lawyer, you probably have someone in your family who is also a doctor or a lawyer. But what does that come with? You understand how to shadow, you understand how to apply for residency, you understand, all those, you understand both the applying for medical school, the whole process of Matthew, a lot of stuff is not new to you because you've seen it, you've celebrated it in the light. We need to continue to, again, question what we take for granted. Not just about what students know, but also what they can afford in every facet of from college and graduate school, because it's still there. How do you, when Les recommendation become even more important, or if you're in a PhD program, signing up on someone's research project early on so you can get that research experience, get that training, whether you're doing whether in the sciences, the social science, or the humanities, traveling with a professor, getting on their projects, writing papers with them, understanding what the new coin of the realm is. We need to demystify that process in both the undergrad, but also in our graduate and professional schools as well.
Before I give, because we have about 60 seconds left, there's another question that popped up in the chat that I want to pitch to Maria and Clint, and you all will have about 30 seconds to answer. Sorry about that. But how do we effectively problematize knowledge structures like peer review? How do we bridge this in a way that we are open to incorporating other authorities? And I think both of you started to speak to this. So 30 seconds. Clint, you kick us off, then Maria, you have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it ended up being that I made a different set of career choices, right? Like I got my PhD and I'm a staff writer at a magazine now, as compared to being in academic. And I think that is in part because I had professors. I think of Matthew Desmond, who for me modeled what it meant to try to be in conversation with a wide range of audiences, right? And to recognize that there is a lot of value to peer review and what it means to be in conversation with your colleagues, but that we should not limit ourselves to thinking that that is the only way by which we can communicate to people, and that there's so many important ideas in the academy, and that, for many first generation students, for many Black students, for many Latinx students, I came to graduate school with the specific intention of hoping to gain a toolkit with which to better work on behalf of my community, in the community that I care about. And I think all of us, whether you stay in academia, whether you go into another space, try to figure out what the most effective means by which we can do that are. And I think having faculty encourage students to think about the myriad of possibilities that exist in terms of career choices and career trajectories is a really important part of that.
Wonderful. Maria, any closing thoughts?
Well, no, I totally agree with what Clint has said. I think that we put so much value into academic knowledge when we know that there's so much out there that can be shared and can be innovative and can be, meaningful to our communities, that we need to bring that into academia and have this dialogue. We all work with, as you said, Sherry, theory and practice. That translation, that connection needs to be part of these conversations and the work in academics, because there's a very important disconnect that keeps, keeps making obstacles for people outside academia and within academia to understand each other and to build these paths of support that students need. So I think that this dialogue, it's really important.
Well, we will end there. We are out of town overtime, I believe, actually. But this was such a rich discussion. Thank you to my co-panelists. I'm sure the audience enjoyed this as much as I did. And like I said, we're just beginning the conversation. As you can see, there's so much more to do. So thank you, Hilt. And I will turn it back over to the facilitators.
Thank you so much, panelists. This was a great conversation, and thank you all for joining us today.